Hey there, and welcome back to the Parable Podcast. I'm Danielle Zapchenk. You know, there are so many podcasts out there, so thank you so much for choosing to spend the time with me right here today. A great idea is to share the show with a friend. It's a perfect way to have a conversation starter and really discuss what you both learned from the show. I can't wait for you to meet Sheena Marquis today, who helps us see God's faithfulness and loving arms in the difficult parts of our lives.
That even if things aren't going well, He's with me. It's a time of transition, or I have a lot of questions, or even just living in the state of Texas and the tragedy that just happened here. God, why would you allow something like that to happen? Or even, just the shooting in Buffalo as well, as a woman of color, as a mom of a little black boy, like, God, why? And just being able to have that experience that I had as a 15-year-old, when I have those questions of saying, I can look back and see in that time of need, in that moment, like, God, let me know that He's with me.
Here's my conversation with Sheena Marquis. Well, Sheena, thank you so much for being on the Parable Podcast today. I'd love to ask you, we're kind of in the midst of summer. What is one of your favorite memories of summer as a child?
I grew up going to camp every summer. I live in Texas and I worship at the Salvation Army. So the Salvation Army, in different states has their own summer camps. And so I would go to Bible camp. I would go to music camp. Music camp was probably maybe the most formative experience. It's where I met my two best friends, my lifelong best friends, and learned to play an instrument, learned how to worship, spent some time in the Word as well and growing. But yeah, I think just being in that home away from home, just learning who I was as a person and growing in my knowledge of the Lord and music and in Bible study. And I don't know if you were a summer camp kid as well.
Yeah, I went to a couple camps, and usually sometimes, I don't know, I was in Wisconsin, so we did a lot of winter camps for our youth group. But I just feel like there's those pieces, those special moments, and then you kind of see how that's connected back to the things that we love later in life.
For sure.
Are you a singer?
Yes. I learned to sing in church, part of the kids choir. And then eventually as I got older and people, I guess, learned that I could sing, I got invited to, help lead worship. So I started doing that when I was probably 15 and was kind of scared out of my boots. Little Texas reference there. So I've just been singing really for the Lord, and through the pandemic, having a little bit more free time, being home with my kid, the Lord has also just been using that in my quiet time to write. So I've written a few things and hopefully get to release those into the world soon, and just pray that they're a blessing. So
I love that. Would you say it's a worship style, or do you just you have a certain genre that speaks to you?
I guess some worship, some I don't know, maybe a little more contemporary. I feel like every song that I've written has a different kind of feel, and maybe it's inspired by the kind of music that I listen to as well. But yeah, I wouldn't say maybe one central thing, but it's all very, I would say, worshipful. Yeah.
Sheena, tell me about your family. What do you do?
So my family, I am married, been married for 11 years. We celebrated 11 years on New Year's Eve, and I have a son who will be 6 this summer, and we have 2 dogs. Yeah, so we actually just moved back to Texas over the holiday season. And this is where I'm from, where all of my family is. So I have 2 of my siblings are here, my niece and nephew, my mom, all my aunts and uncles, and most of my cousins are still here. So a very tight-knit family. We still get together. Actually, my sister and brother-in-law were just here yesterday. We took the kids to the park. Very tight-knit family. My mom's side of the family is Mexican-American. So, of course, we get together and you've got these big gatherings, and there's, carne asada, and there's loud music, and it's home. So I've really missed it.
I love that feeling of when you're at a certain place and you're just whatever the feeling, maybe it's not even the specific people, it just feels like home. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
How did you meet your husband?
So we actually met at camp. Being a part of the Salvation Army, there's a huge brass band history. And so every month, the different brass bands of kids from all across the state to get together, and young adults. And so he actually moved. He's from Chicago. He moved to Dallas, and we met at one of those rehearsal times. It was not love at first sight. I was very weird. I had just seen the movie Fun with Dick and Jane. Do you remember that one? It's got
Jim Carrey. Yeah.
So there's a scene where he gets in the elevator and he's invited to the very top floor. He thinks it's a promotion, but he gets into this massive room, and the senior VP is on the other side and holding out his hand. So Jim Carrey walks walks the entire floor length of the room with his hand out. And it's the most awkward thing. But I had just seen it and I thought, I'm going to try this out. So we met. He was on the other side of a rehearsal room. I walked through the door and I'm like, oh, you must be Jeff. Because I've heard, he's moving. He's the new guy. So I walk across the room and do this thing. And anyway, he likes to tell that story because he thought I was the biggest weirdo. Oh, my goodness. Yeah, eventually, we had a lot of the same friends. Some of his friends had moved down from Michigan and we hung out a lot. And eventually I started working in the music department and just getting to know each other and spend more time together. And yeah, we grew a friendship and then fell in love and got married and the rest is history.
So you and your husband for a while were traveling ministers, is that right?
Yeah.
Through the Salvation Army. So tell me, what was your favorite memory or experience being able to go to different places?
We very much like to travel and explore new towns and new cities and meet new people. And so I think part of the blessing of that ministry is that we got to serve in 2 different locations in Florida. One kind of a smaller town outside of Jacksonville, Florida called Middleburg. So you might not have heard of it, but it's small. It's a little rural, there's definitely more space, less traffic, all of that. So we got to experience a slower side of life and just getting to know the people in our church. And I think being a pastor is just a very special ministry because you get invited into spaces in people's lives that not everyone's invited to. Of course, you get to celebrate, things like weddings and babies being born, but then there's also those intimate times of, when people are sick or in the hospital or they have accidents, and just being able to be a part of people's lives for that and to see testimonies are being formed and seeing people being able to give that glory to God, at the end. And so I think that's probably one of the most beautiful parts is wherever we go, we got to be a part of people's lives in that special way.
What a blessing to hear everybody's stories. I mean, this is what this show is all about. We get to hear those pieces of everybody's life that sometimes we think is just ordinary, but really, I've heard so many people share something and it connects with me so deeply and it helps me witness God in my own life and how he's working in my own life. So Sheena, I do have some more questions about what you're up to these days, but first let's get into your story. What's something that you'd like to share with us today?
So, I talk a lot about my church, which is the Salvation Army, but the reason I got connected to the Salvation Army is growing up, my family didn't have a lot of stability. And so we actually came to the Salvation Army seeking shelter. I think I was probably 4 or 5 years old and my parents had just split up, a domestic violence situation. And so my mom and my 2 sisters at the time, we found ourselves at the Salvation Army and we were living at the shelter in Arlington, Texas. And, being a young person, I didn't really maybe know all that was happening or all that was going on. But I do remember that the shelter was part of the same building as the church, the Salvation Army Church. And so we got invited to come and worship. And so we would walk down that hallway, every Sunday and very quickly just recognize that we were loved, that we weren't being treated really any differently than all the other families that were there, even though, we're recipients of the shelter program and the social services. And so, yeah, being able to be a part and being brought up and having experiences I'll remember the Salvation Army has kind of like a Girl Scout, Boy Scout kind of a program called character building. And I wasn't old enough to be a part of the program, but they let me participate anyway. And I'll just never forget, I learned how to make brownies and it seems like such a small thing, but just being included was a big thing for me. And then we actually came back to that same shelter 2 other times in my life. Once after we relocated back from Hawaii. So long story short, my dad was in the Navy. And so we moved over there to be with him and then ended up coming back and not having stability, of course, moving from Hawaii back to the mainland. And so we were at the shelter again. And then the third time is the one that I remember the most. And that's kind of where my story comes from. I was 15 years old at the time. So, as a teenager, already a stressful time, you're trying to figure out who you are. I just remember we came home one day and my stepfather, who's, my father, he's in my life at the time, he's led a long life of recovery and we praise the Lord for that. But at this point in time, he had relapsed. And so we came home and found, things that were missing from our home. And my mother kind of recognized, okay, this is kind of a pattern and just that, things were being sold and it was likely, so that, he could get whatever substance he was using at that time. So, the Lord got a hold of him. He went into a rehab program program, we went into the Salvation Army shelter again. And, at this point, I had been a part of this church for a really long time. And the people who had been there had seen our family through all these 3 times. And so as a 15-year-old and as a sophomore trying to figure out who I am, I just remember being really angry and frustrated at God because, I had grown up in this church and I'd been so faithful and felt like I was really seeking after him. And how could all of these things just continue to happen to my family? Why were we in the shelter again? Why, was my dad in rehab and recovery again? And I do remember my older sister at the time also ended up moving in with her best friend because there wasn't going to be enough room for us to all stay in the same room as the shelter. So being separated from one of my best friends as well. And then there's just all the questions of like your friends wanting to come over to your house after school. And you're like, well, you can't come, and not feeling like I could explain that to them. And so it was just a time of, I felt really embarrassed about where we were in our life. There was a lot of shame and a lot of questioning. And I just remember one day, it must have been a Saturday because we were home. We weren't at school, but my sister and I were in the room, and there's a bunk bed on one side and then like a full-size bed on the other. My sister's on the full-size bed and I'm on the bottom bunk, and I had my Bible out and open, and I was, doing my Bible reading for the day. And I just remember sitting there and just being so frustrated. Like, God, I believe that you're real and I want to pursue you. I want to do everything right, but I'm just having a really hard time seeing that, you're loving, that you care, that you are providing everything that, like, where are you for my family? Where are you for me right now? Like, I don't understand what's going on. I don't understand why these things are happening. And I just need you to give me a sign like that you're real, because it feels like everything's falling apart. And I'll never forget in that moment, as I'm praying this prayer, I felt the presence of God so heavy, like I'd never, and I haven't experienced anything like that since, but it was as if the very arms of God were enveloping me and wrapping me. And I knew in that moment, like, that he is real, that even if things aren't going well, that he's with me. And so that's kind of a moment that I carry with me at the time of transition, or I have a lot of questions, or even just living in the state of Texas and the tragedy that just happened here, and having questions like, God, why would you allow something like that to happen? Or even, just the recent shooting in Buffalo as well, as a woman of color, as a mom of a little Black boy, like, God, why? And just being able to have that experience that I had as a 15-year-old, when I have those questions of saying, like, no, I can look back and see in that time of need, in that moment, like, God, let me know that he's with me. And so I like to think of that as like my Ebenezer, in the Old Testament. Of course, the Israelites built that structure to say, this far, the Lord has been my help up to this point. And we sing it in Come Thou Fount, right? Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I've come. So when I find myself in those moments, it's like, no, I can point back and say, even when things are not going the way that I think that they should be, or the world is in chaos, like, God is with me. I'm not alone. And when I can recognize that, like, I can have peace, but also just resting in that.
Sheena, that's so beautiful. I love what you did, the context of the Ebenezer, because one, first of all, that's a word we're like, what is that? And we sing it, but sometimes you wonder. But yeah, we need those moments, because when we are in chaos, you feel like you can't see anything, you can't focus on anything. And that's what we need to hold tight to, is the promise of God, the goodness of him, when he wants to just wrap us in our arms when the world feels insane. I'd be curious to know, what would be something that, if maybe somebody hasn't had that moment like that, what would be helping them to try to figure out what their Ebenezer is? Is there any tips or encouragement that you could give them to try to figure out what that Ebenezer is in their life?
I think, for me in that moment, it was an answered prayer. Maybe I didn't realize I was praying, but I was asking God, like, God, I need you to show me. I need proof. We always get down on Thomas because he's like, I have to see the wounds in his side. I have to see the nail scars in his hand. But like, we need that. We do sometimes. And so I think just reflecting back on your life and what has been an answered prayer, because if you've asked for something, or if you have requested something of the Lord and that's been provided, like, that there is an Ebenezer moment, right? You have led me this far. You've brought me this far, and you've brought me to a point where I can remember your goodness and your faithfulness. Even if I don't see you working right now, I can see, looking back, Lord, where you've provided, where you have answered, where you have been present. So I think the prayer trail is a pretty good place to look.
As you were 15 in that shelter and multiple times, did you find somebody, besides finding out how to make brownies and feeling included, was there somebody that stood out to you that helped you see God and just was that presence in your life, somebody that just really loved you through those times?
Yeah, so I don't even know if he'll listen to this, but sometimes people don't even know the impact that they have on our lives. But we had a college student in our church at that time who his family were ministers in the Salvation Army. So they had moved around a lot, but they had just relocated to Texas when he was going to the college in the same town. So ended up coming and worshiping at our church. But I just remember him having like an on fire faith, like wanting to share with everyone his testimony. He was leading worship, just really on fire and passionate for God. And I remember looking at him and thinking, like, I want that. I want that kind of a relationship where I'm just like certain, without a doubt, that God is real, that he's faithful, that he's good. And I think having that example is what led me to even pray that prayer, to be honest with God about where I was and my feelings and just saying, Lord, I want more, but I need to know that you're with me and that you're there. So Stephen Taylor, if you see this or if you're listening, just know that just by living your life and pursuing the Lord, like just a wonderful example. And hope you know the impact that you had.
Sheena, as a mom, just to grow up in that type of environment, how did that shape how you view motherhood, how you view your marriage? Because you have shame, you had that embarrassment and that hurt, and that's part of our story, which I think is important to know, that just because you had this Ebenezer moment with God, that wasn't over. You still had to work through that. How has that impacted being a mom and a wife for you?
My mom had to hustle, being a single mom for a long time, and she did the best that she could. She oftentimes had to work a couple different jobs, and we, of course, had babysitters and other people looking after us. And so the time that we spent with her was very precious. But I guess for me, the biggest thing is for me to be present with my son. And I make mistakes, of course. If things, irk me, I might raise my voice. We're moms, right? That happens.
Sure. What parent doesn't?
But I think being present for him, and this is something I'm learning as well, is just like how to be there with him, even when he's hurt or frustrated, and just like helping him to navigate through his feelings and normalizing things. Like, it's okay to be sad, like it's okay to cry, like if something is hurtful or something hurts your feelings or something makes you upset, it's okay. But then also showing like healthy ways to express that, especially the anger, because it can be really easy to like throw things. But yes, so definitely in my parenting of just being present even in those challenging times when emotions are like huge, but not leaving him alone in that. And then in my marriage, I would just say being honest in communication, like if something is, because of the traumatic childhood and upbringing that I did have, just being honest about why something might upset me or why something might hurt me, and then having that conversation. Because we're very opposites, where my husband's like, we have to hash things out now, we have to talk it out now. And I'm very much like, retreat, get away. I don't know what's happening or what these feelings are. I don't feel comfortable talking about them. But yes, just like that it's normal and communication is great. So
yes, I would say that's our top thing. I just say that to everyone. I say it to, we have 2 kids, a 12-year-old girl and a 9-year-old boy. And my husband and I, we've been married for almost 15 years. But it's that communication process, because there's like all of a sudden something is triggered in some way. And I'll just think to myself, like, I can't believe like that would ever do that. Or I'm imagining this is what he's thinking. And the truth is we have to communicate that out, because really it's not even the case. Like, well, I just closed the door. So, it's just something as simple as that. So yeah, communication is huge. So you have transitioned from being a minister that is traveling through the Salvation Army, and now you are a social worker for a hospital. Is that correct?
Yes.
What made you want to transition? What was your prompting to go in that direction?
The biggest thing for us is we felt like the Lord was leading us to community and like stable community, because, as ministers in the Salvation Army, you can be moved anywhere. We're in the Southern Territory, so we could have been moved anywhere from Texas up to Maryland and Georgia, Tennessee, which is great and it's exciting. But we were starting to recognize for our son and even for us, like we really just felt like the Lord was calling us to a stable, static community. And for us, that's here in Dallas. And so we actually attend a church where a lot of our friends are there with their kids who are like the same age as our son, and our family's here, and we have that support. So that's what led us here, which meant, we had to step back from that ministry. And my education is actually in social work. So I have my graduate degree in clinical social work. But I will say I was terrified to transition back because, as an officer, you're provided with everything that you would need, right, to be able to focus on ministry. So we had a house, we had a car, and all of that we had to leave in order to come and move home. And so just trusting that the Lord would provide something. And so that's how I landed at the hospital that I work at now. And I did have some conflicting feelings of okay, Lord, I know that all of life is ministry, right? Sometimes we can I guess I will say in the church, sometimes we elevate the pastoral role, but all of life is ministry. If you're a doctor, you get to minister in a certain way. If you're a teacher, you get to minister in another way. So definitely been wrestling with not being a full-time pastor. But the Lord opened a door for me to be able to work at a nonprofit faith-based hospital. So we start every day with scripture and prayer, over the intercom system. I didn't expect that at all. But also just if I walk into a patient's room and they're having a really hard time and they are someone of faith, I can pray with them and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not going to get called into the office. And so just being able to have the opportunity to continue to openly minister, even without the role of pastor. But we're invited as social workers, as case managers into these crisis moments. Families are in the hospital and their loved ones are sick. And a lot of times they are just beside themselves because they don't know what they're going to do or what their next step is going to be. But to be present, to listen, to help them problem solve and figure out what it's going to look like when they do go home from the hospital. That has just been the biggest blessing and ministry as well. So that's what I'm doing now. And yeah, I love it.
It's almost kind of the same thing, but you're in one location.
Sure.
There's different people coming in and out of the hospital every day. And so you get to technically travel to their rooms. And so it's kind of the same thing. It's just God's using it in a different way. Tell me was there this first, I'm going to tell you this, okay. I would have that same fear of transitioning too, of wondering is this really what God wants me to do? Is this the ministry level? I think about that as a person who is very heavily involved in our church. You just kind of set things to the side, oh, well, this is somehow separate or better or less than. And really, you're right. It's not. It's all equal. We're all using our same gifts. So was there that idea of fear or shame or wondering, is this the right step for us as a family, holding you back in any way?
Oh, for sure. And I think one of the biggest things for me, biggest fears was what were other people going to see? The people that continue to minister in the Salvation Army. And I think that's wonderful that the Lord can call and keep people. It wasn't that way for us, but I think we had the conversation of what are we going to and what is our life going to look at? And is it going to be something where people can say, oh, well, they left and they have something great going on versus oh, well, they kind of left and what are they doing now? And that's such a silly fear to have because, we shouldn't fear what man thinks. If we're truly following the Lord and what he has for us, then that should be enough. But that was a really big fear for me. Is what I'm going to be deemed worthy in other people's eyes, But yeah, we've just been affirmed and we have peace in every decision.
I was just talking with some girlfriends last night. We were talking about how some people feel the only relevance that they have in their life is their job or their title or whatever role. And truly, we have to be aware of that because at any moment, anyone could lose their job or a role could change in any way. So just being aware that relevance is really found only in Christ. And that's where we need to hold our hearts to. We're human, right? So we have those moments where I don't know. And we question and we wonder. And I like that you said that in the beginning when you were back in that shelter, questioning, you're angry, you're wondering. I think that's healthy. I think that's good because I think God wants us to wrestle through these different seasons of our life. Sheena, you had wrote on Instagram, you had wrote that you were stepping into a season where you felt challenged to offer all that there was of you. What did you mean by that, offering all that there was of you?
I think we all have a lot of gifts. And I think we get, at least for me, I got stuck in the the trap of thinking like I can only be good at one thing. Like if I want my life to count, I need to do one thing and do it really, really well and be like the best at it. Because I don't know, like you see people and they're like, okay, well, that person's a good preacher and that's what they've dedicated their life to, right? But there's also a lot of other things that we don't see. And so I've kind of been trying to change my mindset into thinking that like, no, I'm going to invest and I'm going to hone every gift God has given me because I want to be available to him, like every piece of me, not just one part that I feel like might be the most worthy or that the other, other people in the world might say that's the one thing that you need to focus on. Like if the Lord's given you a gift of writing, then write for his glory. If the Lord has given you a gift of music, then like sing for his glory. If the Lord has given you the ministry of presence, then like go and be with people. But I don't know. I just think there's the tendency to give into that lie, like, no, put these things aside and focus on one. But God gets the most glory when we give him all of ourselves. And so for me, I don't want to push anything aside. I want to use it all.
Just being aware of that too. I remember listening to Jill Briscoe in Dallas, of all places. It was an IF gathering. She was I think she was talking more of like, how do we know? Like we have all these boxes of our lives, kind of like gifts, but what is most important? How do we know which direction God is asking us to go in, and it definitely leaning into this discernment that we have in our life. But she said, you know what, you can have all the boxes, but sometimes one of the boxes, two of the boxes are going to be a little bit more forward, and then the other ones get pushed back. And that's just living in different seasons. Because I think we both are moms, but our style of being a mom is going to change when our kids grow up, when even just different grades, and then they leave the house. Like the way I parent now is probably going to be different later in life. So being to have that idea, that willingness to be flexible it's always challenging, but just to know that it's okay. And there's different seasons. You even think about Jesus's life too. I mean, he was in ministry for 3 years, but even beforehand, it was a season of just preparing himself. So when you were thinking about if shame or worry or wondering what people thought about you and transitioning or whatever, how did you continue to listen to truth and love and hopefully hearing that louder than all those other voices in your head?
Well, staying connected to the Lord, of course, because we really believe that he was the one who was calling us to this next step in our journey, but also just having a group of close friends who we had cultivated a spiritual, relationship to where, these people knew parts of our testimony. They prayed for us. They knew our hearts. And so having people that we could have those honest conversations with where we could say, oh, here's what we're feeling, or here's like the shame. And so being able to have them reflect that back to us and just say, like, no, if the Lord is calling you to this and he's opening the doors, like he's giving you affirmation, people are going to have opinions one way or the other, right? So why not be obedient? And the opinions will be there. But at the end of the day, you will know that you were obedient and you followed what the Lord was doing. So definitely having a community of people who know you, who know the Lord, who know his word, and know how to encourage you to be faithful.
Sheena, thank you so much for just sharing everything, bringing us back to that moment when you were in the shelter with your family, and just to see God's faithfulness, what he's done in your life. When you had said in the beginning of like that they just accepted you, and I see that in you now. And just meeting you today, just to hear the stories of traveling and meeting other people, and now just being able to do social work and be at a hospital where you get to speak life into those folks. And so just accepting them and loving them where they're at, and showcasing Jesus to them. So thank you for sharing with us today. If people wanted to get connected to you or learn more about your music or anything, you have any writing projects, how can they do that?
Yeah, so I'm in the middle of transitioning my Instagram. So I would say if you want to follow me on Instagram, it's Sheena J. Marquis, and then SheenaMarquis.com. I'm giving people that now, so now I have to continue to write. It's like accountability.
Yes, that's super helpful. We'll put all of that in the show notes. Sheena, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Wow, what a story from Sheena. When I get to hear stories every week on this podcast, but for Sheena today, it helps me better have empathy understanding different people's perspectives, to go back to think about what it was like as a 15-year-old girl to be in that shelter, the emotions that are running through her head and what her family life was like, something that I've never experienced. It just makes me grateful to be able to hear that and connect that and see God in my story as well. Be sure to connect with Sheena if her story impacted you. All of her info and her contact information is in today's show notes at daniellezapchenk.com. Also, we love to have some reflection time through the show to be able to hear the person's story and then reflect back on it and how that affects our week and how that affects our relationship with God. So, number one, what would you say is one of your Ebenezer moments? And Sheena gave some great information of how to really formulate that. If we've never even thought about that, maybe we didn't even know what an Ebenezer was, but it helps us form those moments that we can look back to. It's kind of this stake in the ground moment of saying, okay, this is where I see God's faithfulness. Number two, Sheena had said that she was stepping into a season where she felt challenged to offer all that there was of herself. So how can you offer all that you have of yourself almost as an act of worship this week? Thank you for listening. You know what? Come and follow me on Instagram or Facebook. That's at Danielle Zapchenk. That's Zapchenk. I'd love to talk and connect with you over there. And you could subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, whether on Apple, Spotify, or even on YouTube, and leave a rating review. It really helps people find out about the podcast. And thank you so much to my husband for editing the show for us today. He is always behind the scenes, but he makes me sound so awesome. So thanks, babe.
You're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome.
That'll do it for today. Thank you for spending time with me. Remember, your parable showcases God's faithful Ebenezer moments of our life. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.